Story 1.
The suburb of Shermay in Romania had long been left behind. The dirt road obediently stretched under the wheels of the worn-out gray Audi. But the driver knew that within half an hour, it would turn into a soggy country lane. The wipers tirelessly swept the water off the windshield, and the rain kept pouring as it should in mid-October. There is a feeling I get when I look to the west and my spirit is crying for leaving. Played softly in the car. My spirit is yearning to leave too, the driver mumbled, flicking his lighter. The farther, the better. Since the cabin light was off, the flame briefly illuminated a rather handsome face with a straight nose and high cheekbones. After lighting the cigarette, he pocketed the lighter and focused back on the road, especially since the dirt road had ended. The soggy ground had begun. Why? Just why did I come here? George Farkas, an inspector from the Shermay Police Department, wondered to himself. He couldn't even remember the exact name of the village situated between Shermay and the city of Salonta, where he had been sent for an investigation. A god-forsaken hole with no police station. But there was a corpse, and there had to be a criminal. Why couldn't he have stayed in his hometown of Kaposvar in Hungary? Why didn't he go to study in Budapest? Why did he, still a schoolboy, end up in the homeland of Vlad Dracula, nicknamed the Impaler? Cultural exchange, or a way to escape a home where career success was expected of him? From then on, everything went according to plan. Excellent results on almost all exams, dual citizenship, the academy, and lo and behold, a job close to the Hungarian border, where both languages, native and learned, were in demand. Who here needed his vast linguistic abilities? So be it. George smirked and stubbed out the cigarette in the ashtray. After Stairway to Heaven, Misty Mountain Hop followed. The half-bare trees along the road gave way to disheveled bushes, and then, out of the darkness, the guardrails of a bridge over the Crisel Negru River appeared. So, it was close. In the village on the riverbank, there wasn't a single law enforcement officer, so the police authorities of the two neighboring cities, unable to find common ground as usual, made the most idiotic decision, in Farkas's opinion, sending one officer from each city to the crime scene. Through the veil of rain, blurry spots of light broke through. These were the windows of houses glowing. The village, as it turned out after a glance at the sign, was called Skornesti. It had only 2 streets, one running east to west, the other north to south. There were no house numbers or street lighting. Ah, the good old Romanian backcountry. As if nothing had changed since the times of Vlad III. Even now, George was not heading to the Skornesti administration head, but simply to the village elder. At the intersection of the 2 streets stood 4 main village buildings: a school, a hospital, a grocery store, and the administrative building, which also served as the elder's house. And in this 2-story brick house, the light was on. Fortunately for the Shermay police officer, the night and rain had driven the locals into their homes, so he avoided curious glances. Parking near the porch, George pulled on his jacket sleeves and tried to cover the distance from the car to the front door as quickly as possible. The door opened before he had a chance to find the doorbell. He was expected, and the engine noise could be heard even through the rain. Standing before Farkas was a stout, middle-aged woman, likely the wife of the elder, head of the administration. "Are you from Shermay?" she asked. "Yes," he nodded, pushing back his hood and smoothing his black hair with his hand. "The coat rack is by the wall." Farkas noticed that the woman paid more attention to securing the latch than to her guest. "Come into the office. I'll bring some tea. No need to take off your shoes." Refuting the claim about police officers lacking a conscience, George wiped his boots on the doormat before entering. The furnishings on the first floor were quite institutional, from which Farkas concluded that the living quarters were upstairs. In the office, tea was being drunk, and small talk was being exchanged by a stocky, mustachioed man, in whom only the blind wouldn't recognize the elder, and an investigator from Salanta. More precisely, an investigator, round-faced, short-haired, a young woman in jeans and a sweater. Perched on her upturned nose were glasses with thin frames. The conversation had just reached the point where the older man began to tell the younger one in detail about the times of Ceausescu. "Good evening," George drew their attention, pulling out his badge from his inner pocket. "Inspector George Farkas, from the Shermay Police Department." "Ah, you're the one we've been waiting for." The elder circled the table, scrutinized the visitor's badge, and satisfied, extended his hand. "Michael Petrianu." "Nice to meet you." "Investigator Simona Drakel." The young woman greeted him with a friendly smile as she stood up to meet her colleague. "This little one, is she a fan of the Impaler?" George thought as he shook her small hand. "An investigator. Is she even 25? God, what a mess." He was spared the need to come up with a compliment for the investigator by Mrs. Petrianu. The woman brought in tea and silently withdrew, though her silence was equivalent to saying, "Hope these sit-downs are worth something." Nevertheless, sitting down on a chair that had seen better days and sipping the strong tea, George felt he was approaching a state resembling bliss. Mrs. Petrianu had added cherry liquor to the tea. Anyway, Michael glanced at the clock showing 11:30 and downed the rest of his tea in one mighty gulp. "I've already told Mrs. Drakel everything, so I'll just repeat. Sylvia was found this morning. The last time she was seen by half of Skornesti was 2 weeks ago when she left for her sister's place in Salanta. She often went there for a day or two, sometimes for a week or so no one was surprised until she was fished out of the river. That's it." "Did you see the body?" Farkas asked Simona. "No. I arrived 2 hours ago and decided to wait for you." The investigator adjusted her glasses. "You can see it now if you like. Alex has insomnia anyway." "Who, sorry?" "Alex Biashu, our doctor," Petrianu clarified. "In that case, I see no reason to put it off until tomorrow." George finished his tea and stood up. "Especially since tomorrow is almost here." Simona eagerly sprang to her feet, and Farkas finally understood why they had sent her. A murder is a serious matter, but in a place like Skornesti, it's almost impossible to botch it. In a village where everyone knows everyone, it's hard not to find the killer. The inspector felt a slight pang of envy. Simona Drakel, lucky with her superiors, was sent to gain experience because the muscle, if needed, would be the Shermay colleague. George Farkas, on the other hand, was sent by superiors who didn't like him, simply to deal with something that any rookie could handle. On the way to the hospital, Simona handed George a small jar that smelled strongly of mint. "What's this?" "Something like Vaseline. I swiped it from our pathologist." The girl's glasses gleamed from under her hood. "Rub it under your nose, you know. Bodies." "Got it, thanks." Farkas smiled. A resourceful girl, this Drakel. Corpses that must be examined as part of the job aren't always found immediately. George couldn't stand the stench of decomposition, but at least it never made him sick. As for Simona, judging by her voice, she had a worse relationship with this smell than he did. The door was opened by a lanky, graying man. Judging by the dark circles under his eyes and the smell of valerian, he really did suffer from insomnia. After a brief exchange of greetings and introductions, Alex Biashu led the officers and the elder to the morgue. Not that the village hospital particularly needed this room, but no doctor ever knows when they'll have to deal with a corpse or how long they'll have to wait for a city pathologist. "Here, take a look," the doctor said in a colorless voice, lifting the white sheet. "Oh." Simona quietly exhaled a cloud of steam. The temperature in the morgue was lower than outside. George mentally agreed with his colleague. Indeed. Oh. The body lying on the table belonged to a woman in her 30s, dark-haired and very likely attractive. At least she had been attractive before spending a week in the river. The cause of death was obvious. A deep, jagged wound on her neck. What had caused it, Farkas couldn't immediately determine, as the water and river creatures had worked on the corpse. Nevertheless, the crime clearly fell under the category of murder with particular cruelty. "Tell me, Dr. Bieshu." George accepted the thin file containing the preliminary examination report from Alex, but didn't rush to open it. "Was anything found under the victim's nails?" "Yes," the doctor nodded. "Wolf fur. So, what do we have?" A week ago, Sylvia Bogner was returning home from Salanta, where she had been visiting her sister. She was returning late in the evening, but as usual, she didn't take a taxi because she was an athletic woman and rode a bicycle. It was quite a distance, but enough to keep her in shape. Mrs. Bogner wasn't afraid of anything in her native surroundings, even at night, especially since she had a permit to carry a weapon. The lady's revolver didn't help her. Near the village, someone attacked Sylvia and tore her throat open. The fur under her nails suggested that Sylvia was killed by wolves. But this possibility was cast into doubt by Dr. Bieshu, who determined that the wound on the woman's neck was inflicted by claws, which is not typical for wolves. Two other factors also argued against a wolf attack. First, starving predators usually attack in winter or early spring, and second, wolves wouldn't have dragged the body away from the road to dump it in the river. The only remaining question was, did the killer actually eat the victim's liver? "Inspector Farkas, are you awake?" A whisper came from the door. "No, I'm not asleep," George muttered, groping for his shirt, and was glad he had gone to bed without taking off his jeans. The Petrianu house had a guest room, but only one, so George had graciously spared the lady of his company by sleeping in the living room. "Can't sleep?" He smirked as Simona Drakel slipped into the room with a guilty look. "Can't sleep," the young woman admitted. Mrs. Petrianu said the locals still believe in werewolves. I'm saying this because everyone seems to find Sylvia Bogner's murder strange. Mr. Petrianu didn't tell you anything because he didn't want you to laugh at him. He claims the killer is some lunatic named Mark, whom Bogner turned down. And what do you think? Could it be a maniac? George cracked the window open, now that the rain had stopped, and lit a cigarette. He didn't have time to offer one to the investigator. She had already shaken her head in advance. The inspector tossed the pack of cigarettes onto the couch, turned on the wall lamp to avoid talking in complete darkness, and settled back by the window. A maniac would have done his work demonstratively for show. He wouldn't have thrown the body into the river. On the contrary, he would have left it in plain sight. Most likely, this is revenge. And most likely, it was someone Sylvia knew well and didn't feel the need to reach for her weapon. 9 out of 10, the killer is a local. Besides, the killer wanted the first thought to be about wolves. Claws can be made of iron after all. And I don't believe the killer ate her liver. People, Miss Dracul, are exceptionally inventive creatures. I wish I had your confidence, Simona sighed. I've never dealt with murders before. Farkas flicked the cigarette butt into the darkness outside the window. May I ask a personal question? Where did I get that surname? Drakel smirked. Exactly. I changed it 3 years ago. I've always admired Vlad Dracula. He was a great man, though cruel. He almost won the war against the Ottoman Empire. Well, he wouldn't have defeated such a monster. Farkas recalled his history lessons. The Sultan had an army of 250,000 men. He would have won, Simona insisted stubbornly, if Matthias Corvinus hadn't betrayed him. Her brown eyes gleamed as if it were Farkas himself who had advised King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary in the 15th century to betray Vlad Dracula, the ruler of Wallachia. Well, it was clear what her favorite subject in school had been. All right. George raised his hand in a conciliatory gesture. I admit, our king wasn't a saint. But it's been half a millennium, and tomorrow we have to interview a damn lot of people. Don't you think, Miss Drackle, it would be wise to get some sleep? Early the next morning, Inspector Farkas not only shaved but also put on a tie, although he despised the noose around his neck almost as much as the stench of decay. However, duty called, and when it came to interviewing the local population, many still viewed a tie as a sign of respectability. By evening, George and Simona had gathered statements from almost all the adult residents of Skornesti. Some were charmed by Inspector Farkas, others by Investigator Drackle, and others still by their stern eyebrows and official badges. However, more than half of these statements were of no value whatsoever or were overly detailed. No, it's better for a police officer not to be overly charming. After sifting through the unnecessary details, it turned out that Sylvia Bogner was loved in the village only by the school children and their parents, who couldn't get enough of their children's successes. The rest of the Skornesti residents disapproved of her too liberal lifestyle by village standards. If she weren't a teacher from God, she would have long been kicked out of her job. However, the village primary school only had 3 teachers. 3 people had no alibi for the time of the murder. First on the list of suspects was Mark Bishu, the cousin of the local doctor. Contrary to popular belief, he wasn't insane, but simply a person with an incredibly bad temper and a right to carry a weapon. He didn't live in the village for long periods, had no permanent job, and refused to give a statement in a particularly harsh manner. Michael Petrianu insisted on Mark's guilt, pointing to his hot temper, and the fact that shortly before the murder, Mark and Sylvia had a heated argument. The other 2 without an alibi were the victim's colleagues, 2 school teachers, both single women. One of them, a grandmotherly figure, Ilona Olt, claimed she was bedridden with a fever, while the other, Sylvia's contemporary Lena Ionescu, refused to explain anything. The only thing Simona heard from the irate Ionescu about Bogner's murder was, "Serves her right." "Without a warrant, we can't arrest him, interrogate him, or search his place," Simona Drackle concluded gloomily, staring into her empty coffee cup. "And he won't give a statement no matter what." Farkas paced back and forth across the room they had occupied in Mr. Petrianu's house, pulled out and put away the pack of cigarettes again, and swallowed a curse. Everything that had happened in Skornesti bore the mark of the famous Romanian carelessness. Dr. Bieshu lacked the necessary equipment and qualifications for a thorough medical examination. Instead of fixing the situation, the authorities had sent 2 people here, hoping they would deduce and solve the case. It was, of course, easier and cheaper, but George hated playing the role of the Lord. "I wouldn't rule out Ionescu's guilt if I were you," George said, though he couldn't remember when he and Simona had switched to informal terms today. Although, he suddenly tossed his jacket to the young woman and grabbed his own. "Let's go." "Where to?" Simona barely managed to keep up with his long strides as she hurriedly put on her jacket. "To the crime scene," Farkas replied to his colleague and to Mrs. Petrianu, who had peeked out at the noise. "Only the local amateurs have combed through there." The road that Sylvia Bogner had traveled for the last time in her life ran along the river. The inspector and the investigator arrived at the scene within 15 minutes. It was getting dark, so George pulled a couple of flashlights from the trunk. "What are we looking for?" Simona asked. "Something the local trackers didn't look for, and that hasn't washed away in a week." They stepped off the road where Sylvia's bicycle had been found and moved toward the river. Farkas believed that this was where the body had been dragged to the water. He had a vague idea of what to look for after a week of continuous rain. The first thing that came to mind was a cigarette butt, as only Mark among the 3 suspects smoked. "George, I found something." Farkas hurried to Simona, but when he got there he realized she was no longer focused on her discovery. The young woman was shining her flashlight between the trees, listening intently. "Someone's there," she whispered. As if in response, something cracked and rustled in the darkness. It could have been a wolf, a fox, or another careless forest creature. Or maybe not. George drew his pistol from its holster and took a few steps toward the sound. "Who's there?" he demanded as firmly as he could. No one answered. But about 100 meters away, 2 green eyes lit up. The flashlight beam caught dirty gray fur in the darkness. And then the creature began to approach rapidly. Farkas fired. 3 times. Whoever or whatever this green-eyed beast was, and it definitely wasn't human, it should have taken 3 bullets to the chest or neck. But it didn't stop. It only grew more enraged. Dying a heroic death at the fangs of a maddened beast was not in George Farkas's plans. Grabbing Simona by the sleeve, he bolted out of the forest. Fortunately, Drackle was a fast runner too, and she didn't stumble once. "Get in the car!" Farkas barked as they burst onto the road. He could feel the pursuit on the back of his neck. Whipping around, he aimed both the flashlight and the pistol in one direction and emptied the entire magazine into the shaggy shadow. The lead knocked the creature down, but it clearly didn't kill it. Meanwhile, Simona scrambled into the car and flung open the driver's side door. Before the mysterious beast could recover, George leaped behind the wheel, slammed the door shut, and tossed the gun into Simona's lap. "Magazine in the glove compartment. Reload it," he ordered, starting the engine. He barely had time to pull away from the shoulder when the still alive and lively creature burst onto the road. Seeing it in the headlights, Simona let out a squeak, and George went pale as a sheet. A wolf, standing on its hind legs and towering like a calf, that's what it resembled. However, Farkas hadn't forgotten where the gas pedal was in his fear. The gray Audi, splashing mud, shot forward and knocked the shaggy beast aside. For half a minute, George could still see the creature in the rearview mirror. It was chasing the car, awkwardly swiping at the air with its broken paw. Hand. Damn it. George exhaled, loosening the knot of his tie with one hand. "A werewolf," Simona whimpered. "It's all true. It can't be." Farkas wanted to shout, but he bit his tongue. How else could you explain a shaggy humanoid with a wolf's head? When the mud-splattered gray Audi stopped in front of the hospital, Dr. Alex Bieshu was still awake. Lately, he hadn't been sleeping much at all. Responding to the loud and persistent knocking, the doctor opened the back door, which led closer to the 2 rooms he occupied. "Do you have a problem?" he asked, though the signs of shock were all over his guests' faces. "A whole trainload of them," the disheveled inspector nodded, letting his colleague go ahead and glancing into the darkness before stepping inside. "Can I help with anything?" "First, please give us something for our nerves." Farkas slid the bolt, peered out the window, shrugged off his jacket, and only then turned to the doctor. Bieshu noticed that he did all this without letting go of the pistol in his right hand. "For the nerves," Alex chuckled. "Sit down, Miss Drackle." The young woman was trembling, and it took her a moment to realize he was addressing her. A minute later, 3 glasses and a bottle of plum moonshine were on the table. "It helps with the nerves very well," the doctor explained, pouring. George downed half a glass in one gulp, while Simona didn't dare such a feat, sipping her medicine in small sips, and Alex barely touched his glass. He was waiting for questions. The inspector didn't keep him waiting long. He placed the pistol on the table and stared intently into the doctor's eyes. "Now, doctor, tell us what's really going on here." "We've got a werewolf in the village." "That's unscientific." Farkas chuckled nervously, gripping a cigarette between his lips, trying to light it, and then noticing that his hands were shaking. "Damn it. Looks like you need more than your colleague does." Bieshu poured him another glass of moonshine, which was at least 50 proof. The medicine had indeed already worked on Simona. The trembling had stopped, her cheeks were flushed, but her gaze remained clear. "You're right." George knocked back another half glass, exhaled sharply, and continued. "There must be some explanation. Listen, back during Ceausescu's time, before the fall of the Soviet Union, were there any experiments conducted here?" Inspector Farkas was 12 when the USSR collapsed and even younger when Ceausescu was overthrown, so he could barely, but possibly, believe in mysterious secret research because believing in werewolves... "Impossible," reason screamed. "Open your eyes," common sense replied. "No experiments, no secret facilities." The doctor shook his head sadly. There was another knock at the door, again from the back entrance. Alex went to open it, and George finally lit his cigarette and turned to the now silent Simona. "Do you have a weapon?" The young woman nodded. The doctor returned, and with him came a tall, stocky, bearded man with a rifle slung over his shoulder, looking every bit the seasoned hunter. "Ah, you're still alive, cop." He smirked, leaning the rifle against the wall. "Did you see the beast? So did you crap your pants from fear?" "So you knew, Mr. Bieshu." George gave Mark an icy glare. "I knew," he nodded, sitting down at the table. "I figured you're a quick guy, you'd manage to get out. But I had Miss Drackle with me. You put a woman's life at risk." "My apologies, Miss Drackle." The man's black beard split into a cheeky grin. "But I think if you join the police, you should be aware of the risks." "I am aware." The young woman snapped. "Irresponsibility seems to be a part of the national consciousness in this country," George muttered through clenched teeth. "Listen, cop, shove your Hungarian pride. You know where." Mark slapped his palm on the tabletop. "Maybe we should talk about the case," the doctor calmly suggested, placing a 4th glass on the table and pouring out more medicine. "But why didn't you tell us anything?" Simona asked, wiping her glasses. "We could have—" "Think with your head, miss," Mark laughed. "Who would have believed me? You'd have arrested me in a minute, and I'd be not only a killer with a split personality, but also a psycho obsessed with mysticism. Petrianu is already jumping out of his pants to pin Sylvia's murder on me. And by the way, you can't do anything. You, Magyar, can try to call for backup, and I'll watch as the medics take you away. In other words, Miss Drackle, we're in deep shit, as the Poles say." Farkas stubbed out his cigarette in the ashtray and reached for another. Everyone but Simona joined him. He couldn't help but acknowledge the reasonableness of Mark's arguments. He really would have considered him a paranoid schizophrenic if he had started talking about werewolves. And he and Investigator Drackle really had no choice but to catch the beast themselves. I almost forgot. Drackle rummaged through her pockets and pulled out a silver cross on a broken chain. "I found this in the forest." "Sylvia's cross," Mark muttered. "I'll kill that bastard if I don't die first." May I take a look? Alex put on his glasses and took the chain from the investigator. The silver at the break had blackened. There's something like burnt skin and singed fur between the links. Exactly. The doctor's cousin snapped his fingers and grabbed his glass. Silver is the only thing that can take these bastards down, although they're damn resilient. Did you two shoot at it? I emptied the entire magazine into it, George replied grimly. Didn't do a damn thing. And George seemed to break its paw when he ran it over, Simona added. Lead is nothing, but the bone will take at least half a day to heal. How do you know so much about these creatures? The young woman asked. I encountered them while serving in the army, and later when I specifically traveled to Poland, then in Slovakia, Western Ukraine, Russia. George nearly choked on his drink. Are you saying that this isn't a one-off mutation? Mutation? Mark sneered. They're everywhere, and they've been around for a long time. Ever read any fairy tales? There's probably something like them in New Zealand, too. Did you think humans are the rulers of nature, the pinnacle of the food chain? Welcome to the New World, Magyar. Farkas was silent for a while, digesting the news. After all, if you look at the statistics of missing persons, Mark Bieshu's words seemed plausible. Wait, what about Western Europe? You can't just eat a person there. Right, buddy, his inner voice remarked sardonically. They don't just eat there, they eat civilly. All right, no arguing with facts. The inspector pulled himself together. If it's a werewolf, it should be human by day. How do we track it down? Any distinguishing marks? This is the first case in our area. Alex Bieshu took the floor. It takes a month to turn into a werewolf. So it's someone who was absent from the village a month or a month and a half ago and brought the infection here. We have 3 candidates. Michael Petrianu, Lena Ionescu, and an old pensioner everyone calls Grandpa Stefan. Stefan's out. Mark waved his hand dismissively. He's got a silver wedding ring. And Ionescu has no alibi. Simona exchanged glances with George. Here's what I suggest. Mark decided to wrap things up. Tomorrow morning you two come to me and I'll make you some silver bullets. I know how to cast them and I've got the equipment. Then we'll see if anyone comes to Alex for a broken arm, and Ionescu won't go anywhere during the day. As if to confirm the existence of Murphy's Law, everything went far from smoothly as planned. It all started with something going wrong with the silver, and since no one else knew how to cast bullets, Mark ended up fiddling with it until almost evening. At sunset, George and Simona, equipped with a magazine of silver bullets each and one silver-plated stiletto between them, finally went to get Ionescu. Mark prudently stayed behind to guard the back door. Farkas had contacted Dr. Bieshu beforehand. He hadn't expected his mobile phone to come in handy in such a hole as Skornesti. It turned out that the doctor had been visited twice during the day. Mrs. Petrianu had come for medicine, and Lena Ionescu had come with a serious dislocation, allegedly the result of an unfortunate fall from a ladder. A dislocation isn't a fracture, but still. The tall, swarthy woman frowned at the visitors. We'd like to ask you a few questions. Well, come in. She nodded toward the living room. George discreetly tried to position himself so that Simona was always behind him. They had agreed that if it came to close combat with the creature, he would be the one to engage. He had secured the stiletto along his forearm, and Mircha's words kept flashing through his mind. Claws are nothing. But if the beast bites you and you survive, you'll become a shapeshifter yourself in a month. Would you like some tea? Ionescu offered, not too insistently. No, thank you. We won't take much of your time. Tell me, does this item look familiar? With these words, The inspector pulled a small plastic bag from his pocket and took out the silver chain. This was it, the moment of truth. Farkas was ready for Ionescu to sprout claws at any moment, but... Yes, that's Sylvia's chain and cross. Lena took the mangled piece of jewelry in her hands without even flinching, and then George noticed that her right hand was bandaged, though he distinctly remembered breaking the creature's left arm. "Is that all you wanted to know?" the teacher asked, handing the chain back. Not quite. The inspector tried not to show how thrown off he was. "You don't have an alibi, Miss Ionescu." Simona saved the situation. "Considering your statements about the victim, could you tell us where you were on the night of October 9th? I shouldn't have spoken so badly about the dead," the woman sighed. "I was with Lucian that night. Ask him. He'll confirm it, just don't ask in front of his wife." "Understood. Thank you for your cooperation, Miss Ionescu. All the best." As soon as they stepped off the porch, George called Mark. He felt lousy. The tension and sleepless night were taking their toll. Simona was lucky. She had slept like a log until morning, while he couldn't sleep even after the moonshine. "False alarm, Mark. It's not her." "Damn it all to hell!" Bishu barked on the other end. "Get over here. I don't care who the werewolf is. We're tracking that beast tonight." George looked at the crimson streak of the dying sunset. The sun was gone, and now all the cards were in the werewolf's hands. "Go to him. I'll catch up." When Simona had left, he tried once more to gather his thoughts. The pensioner Stefan had an alibi, and so did Michael Petrianu. Wait. George quickly dialed Alex Bieshu's number. "Doctor, it's Farkas." "What's going on?" the doctor asked, sounding worried. "Lena Ionescu is clean. Tell me, what did Mrs. Petrianu take from you?" "Sleeping pills, antibiotics, and an orthopedic bandage." "Does she suffer from insomnia?" "Yes, she takes sleeping pills regularly." Alex's voice grew increasingly puzzled. "Thank you, doctor, and don't leave the hospital tonight." George had barely finished the conversation when his phone rang piercingly. It was Simona. "George, he killed him." "Stay where you are," Farkas ordered, already running. Mark Bishu's house was literally a stone's throw from the hospital. Had George not known what the man was actually involved in, he would have mistaken his home for the lair of a terrorist moonlighting as a smuggler of precious metals, specifically silver. The inspector arrived within 2 minutes. Dracul, looking green, was sitting on the porch with a mobile phone in one hand and a pistol in the other. Without a word, Farkas looked inside. The heavy stench of blood hit him immediately. "We've lost our Van Helsing." He turned away from the mutilated corpse and the severed head. The hunter hadn't had time to use his rifle against the werewolf. "I called for backup," Simona said. "I didn't mention the werewolf. They'll be here in an hour and a half to 2 hours. "Too long?" George punched the door frame in frustration. "He'll escape by then. Let's go." The investigator hurried after her colleague. With nightfall, both streets had become quiet and empty. It seemed the residents of Skornesti truly believed in the werewolf and were hoping either for luck or for desperate people like the late Mark. "It's Michael," Farkas said as they walked. "He has an alibi." "He doesn't have an alibi. His wife takes sleeping pills, which means she wouldn't wake up even if cannons were fired. This morning, she took an orthopedic bandage from the doctor. Michael must have already healed." The door to Michael Petrianu's house was unlocked. George tossed his jacket by the entrance to avoid being restricted in movement and told Simona to stay behind him. Near the entrance to the office lay Mrs. Petrianu in a pool of blood. Her carotid artery had been torn out. The werewolf had decided to make a break for it and leave no witnesses. That meant he might still be here. Watch the exit and the basement stairs while I check upstairs. Farkas pointed the investigator to a strategic spot between the door and the staircase. If anything happens, don't play the hero. Dive into the pantry. The door seems sturdy. Trying not to show her fear, Drakel nodded. The inspector shifted the pistol to his left hand, drew his stiletto, and climbed to the second floor. He had a feeling the werewolf was still here and wouldn't leave until he finished off those who had been chasing him. After all, during his service, Farkas had solved 2 murders and had the right to trust his instincts. However, the living quarters were empty. "George? Is that you?" A voice called from downstairs, and his blood ran cold. "No. Shoot." He bellowed at the top of his lungs and rushed toward the stairs. A shot rang out below, then another, followed by a howl, a scream, a crash, and silence. Simona. Taking the stairs 3 at a time, Farkas flew into the hall, but it was empty. Only a bloody trail led to the basement. Drakel had managed to wound the beast. "I'm here." Simona's voice came from the pantry. "He heard you and ran off. I'm coming out now." But George didn't let her out. The bookcase standing by the wall, which he shoved with his shoulder, crashed to the floor, blocking the pantry door. "What are you doing?" Drakel screamed. "The backup will get you out." Farkas wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. "Take care, Simona." "George, what are you doing? Let me out. You can't handle this alone. That thing is huge." Simona yelled, but he was no longer listening. The inspector remembered the layout of the house. He had inquired about it, not suspecting Michael at the time, but just out of habit. There was a second exit from the basement, to the garage. That's where George headed. "Have you lost your mind, pal?" His inner voice, playing the role of common sense and self-preservation instinct, asked sarcastically, "You can't handle this alone." "Maybe I have, maybe I can't," George mentally snapped back. "But I won't risk Simona's life. She's poorly trained for this, and you've got your eye on her, haven't you, Magyar? What difference does it make now? I screwed up." "Yeah, pal, you screwed up. First time in your life, but big time. Because of you, Petrianu's wife is dead. Mark is dead. If you'd turned on your brain sooner instead of suffering from lack of sleep and a hangover, you would have figured out Michael earlier. Well, are you ready to pay the price?" "I'm ready," George said quietly as he stepped into the garage. "Are you Michael?" Michael Petrianu, or rather the creature he had turned into, was crawling out of the hatch in the floor. Upon seeing the human, it growled and lunged at him. Despite the injured paw, it moved fast, very fast. George managed to fire 4 shots before the beast knocked him off his feet and sent the pistol flying from his hand. Almost all hand-to-hand combat techniques proved useless against a werewolf, and the only thing Farkas could do was keep the fangs from his throat. The werewolf slashed at his opponent with its claws, while George struggled to land a fatal blow. Even gravely injured, the werewolf was inhumanly strong, and the silver only enraged it further, triggering a reverse transformation. Too slow for it to become vulnerable as a human again. More by hearing than feeling, George realized 2 ribs had cracked one after the other, and he knew he wouldn't last much longer on adrenaline. The pain would overwhelm him, and the werewolf would finish him off. Abruptly ceasing his resistance, George allowed the creature to latch onto him with all its claws, freed his right hand, and swiftly drove the stiletto under the werewolf's jaw. Brain death was instantaneous. The beast twitched and went limp. He had no strength left to stand. Clutching the torn wound in his side and leaving a trail of blood, George simply crawled away from the gray carcass and leaned against the garage wall. Poor Simona, he thought. She'll have to explain all this mess. It's up to her because he would bleed out before the backup arrived. None of the locals would dare leave their houses at night. and there was no calling for Dr. Bieshu's help. His phone was in his jacket. George Farkas suddenly realized he didn't care anymore. Outside, the rain started again.
Story 2.
The dark, starlit night hung low over the sleeping city. Only the lights in a few late windows and the dim glow of street lamps still pierced the darkness of the stone alleys. Grim shadows glided silently through the darkened corners of the streets, and a light breeze wandered aimlessly down the cobblestones, chasing scraps of old, torn newspapers. Tonight was a new moon, and the sky would not be graced with the moon's light, bathing the night in its enchanting glow. And so, the pale mist swirling above the grates of the sewers seemed more sinister tonight, dense and heavy with hidden intentions and secrets. Beneath the feet, trash, mud, and rotting waste crunched and squelched in every direction. From a rusted trash can came the patter of tiny feet and a hurried crunch, followed by the crumpling of paper, likely a rat rummaging through the scraps in search of edible morsels. Around, only the black brick walls of the buildings rose toward the heavens, as if sealing off these narrow corridors from the rest of the world. It seemed as though time itself was dying in these stone cages, never reaching the heights where life and freedom reigned. "Hey kid, got any food?" A dirty, disheveled head popped out from a pile of junk, and half-drunken, weary eyes stared at the late-night wanderer. The young man who had wandered into these depths against his will shivered as he wrapped himself tightly in his thin shirt. He only gave a puzzled look at this, something that emerged from the world, and hurried on, splashing through the puddles of decay and skirting piles of refuse. Behind him, a quiet voice called out, "Damn it, no food. And what's the point of wandering in the dark at night, bothering poor souls?" And silence returned. Another turn ahead, and then another, and yet another. It seemed there would be no end to this crooked street. At least the old half-blind lamps above the iron doors of the houses provided a little light. There was no other way but forward. The young man, who had been wandering the narrow streets so late at night, was named John. He had been born 16 years ago in the port of New York City during a crossing of the Atlantic. But it seemed at that time his family had no need for an extra mouth to feed, and so, just before the ship's departure for the Old World, his mother, overwhelmed by hunger and poverty, brought her newborn son to the nearest orphanage by the Church of the Holy Virgin Mary, where she left him on the dirty steps, disappearing forever into the night and fog. For many years spent in the orphanage, he had tried more than once to remember her face, but he never could. In the church, he studied for several years, learning about religion, history, and other sciences as teachers were available, until fate and the folly of a young mind compelled him to leave the home that had become so dear to him. He was cast out into the littered streets of the big city and plunged into the labyrinth of a new life. Hunger and pain led him to the dark and grim slums, where he sought his path, trying to change his life and escape the darkness into the light that was so fervently preached in the poor orphanage. But only disappointment lay in his way, sprinkled with grievances and hardships. Theft, fights, deceit. These filled his troubled life. Betrayal, death, and shattered dreams etched his soul with the sharp blade of anger and hatred for everything around him. And one day, cruel fate stepped on his throat, nearly choking him, and cast him into the deepest pits of hell. And there, the young wanderer had to find his path. He was tired and sat down by the black moss-covered wall, right on the ground. For too long he had searched for himself in this world, and had found nothing. And so the darkness filled his heart, driving out everything he had lived for, cherished, and loved. All around, only silent walls loomed, pressing down on him with their might, making it hard to breathe, tormenting his already exhausted mind. The cold wind burned his itching skin and sent a shiver through him as if electricity coursed through his body. So what should he do? Where should he go? Where could he find what he had long dreamed of, what he had strived for all these years? Where was the light of hope? Where were love, kindness, and understanding? Silence. There was nothing, and holiness was just a myth. Even the church, where he had lived for so many years, had vanished in the greedy flames of fire, and only the sparks, maddened in their wild dance, all that remained of love and hope, were carried up to the heavens. It was there, on the smoldering ruins, that his world died, the world he had known and loved since his birth, but which he had failed to save and so easily abandoned. And now, only emptiness surrounded him. "You're early tonight, my son," said Father Nicholas, opening the heavy doors of the orphanage and letting John inside. "I'm used to you either not visiting us for quite some time or showing up late at night. Has something changed?" He looked closely with kind eyes, radiating love and tenderness, at the crestfallen young man. "I'm tired, Father Nicholas," John replied with a heavy sigh. He walked into the hall and sat on the first pew from the entrance while the father closed the door behind him. "Something troubles me, and it feels as though there's a huge black hole in my chest, making it hard to breathe. And the darkness trails me, step by step. I'm tired of wandering in this fog. I can't see the way. And the place where I am now, the world where I ended up after leaving these walls, feels like a bleak, stinking swamp. There's no life, no light, no meaning." A dull echo lazily floated under the arches of the high hall, bouncing off the walls in the semi-darkness, illuminated only by the light of a dozen candles burning at the altar. Their flames burned steadily, barely flickering, filling everything around with a mysterious glow. "And you made the right decision to come here." Father Nicholas paused beside John, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Only here can you rest, sheltered from the turmoil that reigns outside, as if pausing the rush of time to contemplate everything that's happening. I will try to understand all your fears and guide you to the right path. But you must follow me. Only then can I lead you to the light." "Yes, Father. I understand all of this and am ready to do what's required. But it feels like I don't have the strength for anything. My hands are heavy like lead. There's emptiness in my chest, a void. I'm afraid." "What are you afraid of, my son? Tell me your fears without hiding them, and perhaps together we can find protection from them. But the beginning of the path is here." The father extended his hand, inviting the young man to approach the altar and kneel. "I do not ask you to clear your mind. I see it is full of desires and passions. I don't need blind worship and vows of renunciation of evil. That's simply impossible in our world. I only wish to help you shed the unnecessary burden of worries and misunderstandings, to let your mind be free, and then you will be free to choose the path that appears before you. Thank you, Father Nicholas. I had nowhere else to go, and no one else to seek help from. Only here do I feel peace. This is your home. It always has been and always will be. Mother is very worried about you. She remembers clearly all the years of your schooling within these walls. You were a good boy. How is she? Is everything all right? I haven't seen her in a long time. She is well. A new group of students has recently come under her care since all those killings started in the city. Many children have been orphaned with no one to help them, and we are glad to have each one and are ready to provide shelter and food as much as we can. You should visit her sometime. You still remember her daily routine. She remains true to her principles and never wavers from them. Yes, I know. But then, a loud knock on the door interrupted him mid-sentence. Someone was furiously pounding on the copper-clad doors with a foot and shouting loudly, drawing the attention of those inside. "It seems something has happened," the father said, hurrying to the doors, shuffling in his night slippers across the stone floor. "Just a minute. Hold on. I'm coming." Once more, the intricate, heavy key turned in the lock, the iron bolt slid aside, and the door opened slightly. A blue fog, driven by the night wind, greedily burst from the street into the building. John saw Father Nicholas freeze, as if struck by lightning, but then he waved his hand and quickly began speaking with someone. He opened the door wider, allowing the night visitors into the church. It was a man and a woman. She was covered in blood, her side torn open, her arm badly scratched, and her eyes filled with nothing but pain and anguish. The man was helping her walk, her arm draped over his shoulder supporting his companion, but he wasn't in much better condition. His left leg was simply oozing thick blood, soaking his pant leg through. His haggard, bearded face was full of horror and exhaustion. But the strangest thing that John noticed in those moments was how Father Nicholas reacted. He still stood in the doorway but was shouting something loudly and monotonously into the darkness, as if reciting a prayer, waving his arms and making strange gestures. And then he crossed himself and forcefully slammed the door shut, quickly locking it with all the bolts and latches. He was breathing heavily, and his tense face was covered in a sheen of sweat. However, the father didn't stay in that state for long. He quickly remembered the late-night visitors and rushed over to them, who had collapsed from exhaustion just 10 steps inside the entrance. "How are you? What happened? Why?" he asked, examining the woman sprawled on the floor, while the man sat beside her, leaning against the armrest of the nearest pew. "It's madness," the man said, shaking his head. "It's hard to even grasp." "They were dogs," the woman whispered faintly, not opening her eyes, closed from exhaustion and loss of strength. She was breathing with difficulty, and bright red foam was bubbling on her lips, likely from a lung injury, which was a grave concern. "Dogs," Father Nicholas repeated, uncertain. "Are you sure?" "Yes, those bloodthirsty beasts came at us right from around the corner. And their eyes, those red eyes, they tore at the soul. We barely managed to realize what was happening and got into our car, but that didn't stop them. They gnawed through the glass and metal as if it were paper, filled with madness. Oh, God. Red eyes." The woman was almost delirious, slipping into unconsciousness. "Yes, those eyes. They seemed to pierce inside me, turning everything inside out," the man continued. "I don't know how we managed to escape and make it here." "And what did you see outside, Father Nicholas?" John whispered softly, kneeling beside the woman. The father cast an angry glance at him. John had never seen such a look before and involuntarily recoiled. But then the father averted his gaze. "I don't know, but it seemed to me that ghosts were dancing in the fog and crimson light was illuminating them. I was scared." "We were too, Father, and we really need your help." The man seemed to come to his senses and looked into Nicholas's eyes. "Please help us." "All right. I hope my humble knowledge will suffice. Here." He pulled a small knife from the folds of his robe, suitable only for cutting vegetables at the refectory table. "Cut the pant leg, free the wound, and let's see how serious it is. Meanwhile, I'll examine your companion. Her name is Alice, and I'm Michael." Nicholas carefully unfolded the tattered edges of the woman's clothing, trying not to aggravate the wound in her side. The sight was horrifying. Part of the skin on her side was missing, and chunks of flesh hung in shreds among the bloody mess. "John, quickly run to the annex. We need clean water, bandages. Try to find a tourniquet and a bottle of tincture for treating wounds. It's on the shelf in the far corner. And hurry, as fast as you can. Her life depends on it." John jumped to his feet as if stung and rushed toward the doors to the storeroom where all the essentials for the orphanage were kept. Medicines, tools, powders, work clothes, fabrics and planks and beams for roof repairs. He tumbled down the wooden stairs and burst into the room like a hurricane, frightened by everything he had just seen. The pain that had tormented him for days receded in those moments, pushed to the background by the tragic events unfolding, but everything happening now only brought more fear. "All right, here's the tincture, bandages, rags, and a basin for water, got it. Wait, here are some towels and cotton wool, too. They'll come in handy. Can't hurt to have more." Grabbing everything he could in his arms, John dashed back up the stairs, even forgetting to latch the door behind him. Rushing to help, he had almost burst into the main hall where the services were held when a terrifying animal growl made him freeze in place. "Oh my God, this can't be happening." Father Nicholas's quiet whisper brought John back to reality, and he peeked out from behind a column into the hall. What he saw almost made him vomit, his eyes widening in horror, and he dropped everything he was holding on the floor before fleeing as if on fire. In the aisle between the pews, where just minutes ago he had left the father and the desperate visitors, much had changed. Instead of the wounded and exhausted man and woman, there now stood blood-soaked, ferocious beasts, gray wolves. Their muzzles were snarling. Sharp teeth gleamed menacingly in the candlelight, and their eyes blazed with a deep crimson. There was nothing human left in their depths, only death and a thirst for blood. Father Nicholas hadn't even had time to defend himself. He only raised his hands to shield his face and squeezed his eyes shut. And the two creatures of darkness and terror pounced on him with a ravenous hunger, mercilessly tearing at his living flesh. They ripped through his throat and tore open his stomach, sending a pile of slick intestines spilling onto the stones. Blood sprayed into the air, drenching everything around. That horrific scene was still etched in John's mind as he fled through the narrow, dark corridors of the orphanage, knocking over several candlesticks in his haste. And he didn't think about those who were still inside the building, unaware of what was happening, who needed help. John bolted out the back door into the street and locked it from the outside, bracing it with trash cans for good measure. Screaming wildly, he ran into the darkness of the alleys and disappeared into the depths of the impoverished quarters. Behind him, flames shot into the sky, several windows on the second floor shattered, and a distant wolf's howl pierced the night, spurring John to run even faster. Enough of sitting in one place. He had to keep moving. There had to be a way out of this labyrinth somewhere, and he had to find it. The young man got up and stumbled along the dark street. The number of streetlights illuminating the path grew fewer and fewer, and soon almost complete darkness reigned on the deserted streets. Only the fog, faintly lit by the starlight, thickened at the ground, spreading across the dirty paths. John was very tired, very hungry, and he couldn't get the final moments of Father Nicholas's life out of his head. The bloody scene refused to leave his consciousness, drawing all his attention, and the pain surged again, gripping his chest. Unable to bear it any longer, John screamed into the night, a long, wrenching cry. The loud echo answered him, shattering against the stone walls. But it didn't help. The pain still choked him, squeezing tears from his eyes. But then John froze. Did it seem so? Or did a painfully familiar silhouette flicker ahead in the fog? Father Nicholas, wait for me. "It's me, John, Father Nicholas." But only silence responded to him. And without thinking whether it was real or just a trick of his exhausted mind, he rushed forward after the shadow. But there was no one there. Around the corner, only an old lantern hung lazily from the wall, casting its meager light on something John hadn't expected to see. Ahead was a solid wall. The street ended, and there was no passage further. Despairing, John approached it on trembling legs, kicking up old trash with his boots, and stopped, breathing heavily, just a step from the wall, touching its cold stones with his hand. He was doomed, it seemed, to wander forever in the twilight of these passages and streets, fleeing ever further from his nightmare, but the nightmare didn't retreat. It crept slowly behind him, sometimes drawing closer, sometimes disappearing again into the fog, and soon it caught up with him. A large animal shadow fell on the wall. It was the silhouette of an enormous, ferocious wolf, and the beast was slowly approaching the motionless man. Then something happened, but John, staring blankly ahead, didn't even understand what it was. His body was struck by a powerful blow, and bright red blood splattered onto the wall before him. He could only stare at it, still not fully grasping what it was. His thoughts and feelings seemed to die within him, and everything around was just a dream, a nightmare born of reality. Then came another blow, and John fell into the filth, collapsing onto the rotting scraps. Then came darkness, without sound, without smell, without pain, without nightmares. When John came to, it was pitch dark. It seemed completely impenetrable, yet he could somehow see everything around him. A part of the wall, a pile of decay and scraps, a heap of bundled newspapers. The pain no longer tormented him, and his thoughts raced in his head faster than swift horses. Where was he? What had happened? And then the answer appeared on its own. From the fog swirling in the dark street, a large black wolf emerged. Its thick fur gleamed silver, and its crimson eyes burned with a hellish fire. "You were accepted into the pack tonight," a voice suddenly spoke directly in John's mind. "Now you are one of us, one of Harlog's children." And in that moment, John understood everything that had happened to him that day, but there was nothing he could do to change it. And then John roared, spreading his arms wide as if bidding farewell to the world he had known, the world that had been familiar to him, the world he had understood. Afterward he collapsed onto the stones, his body racked with sobs. But soon his cries turned into a deep, guttural growl, and in the middle of the street a young gray wolf stood. Its red eyes gleamed like rubies in the darkness. "It happens to everyone. Accept it." John howled long and loud, raising his shaggy head toward the heavens, and then he bolted into the night. The second wolf vanished into the shadows behind him. Only the mist stirred above the ground, disturbed by the powerful bodies of the beasts as they disappeared into the darkness.